I want to ask you about the reporting you've been doing most recently, because this is a very clear example of one of those stories where, as much as we may give credit to your investigative abilities, the core of the story is literally a thing that the president signed quite out in the out in the open, not very difficult to find out about. But you said, this is a case where the mainstream media was just distracted by this thing and doesn't really notice the implications of the directive. And so maybe you could explain why you feel like this is, this NSPM 7 national security. What is the piece?
Yeah, NSPM 7. It stands for National Security Presidential Memorandum 7. There's only been 7 of them this term. This is completely distinct from executive orders, of which there have been over 200 at this point. But the media conflated the two, and you can find several articles that have still not been corrected where they describe it as an executive order. And my guess is that that's why this got overlooked. They were like, oh, it's another one of these 200 things that are. So in the case of executive orders, some of them can be significant, but in a lot of cases, it's kind of like narrow day-to-day operations of government stuff. Whereas a presidential memorandum, this is a sweeping strategy statement that tasks the entire federal government with saying, these are our priorities for the rest of the administration. Focus on that and carry it out. That's what the chief executive says. And so I think just not having the national security chops to realize, because it's a subtle difference. I can see why you would mix them up. They're posted to the White House. He's always doing these, provocative executive orders. So I kind of get why it wasn't easy. What I was surprised by was that the national security specialists didn't say something about this. Because just to give you a historical example, during the Carter administration, they had a national security presidential memorandum. Often they're classified. In the case of Trump, we're talking about NSPM 7. 6 was classified. We don't know what it was. So in the case of Carter, when one was, I think it was declassified, it showed a huge change to nuclear policy in regards to the then USSR. So there were massive protests in opposition to this. It became a huge political firestorm. And I think that's the appropriate response to something, because these are major decisions. And if it's a decision that departs from past or popular practice, it makes sense that people would have that reaction. So in this case, I think it should have that reaction. And just to run you down what NSPM 7 is, so it's tasking all of federal law enforcement to prioritize domestic terrorism. And the way that you go after terrorism is different than normal crime fighting. Ordinary crime fighting, a crime has already been committed, and then you go and work backwards to try to find evidence of who committed the crime, and then you charge them. In the case of terrorism, you're basically getting into pre-crime, because you are trying to preempt the attack. So from the perspective of proponents of counterterrorism theory, I'm trying to be generous to them here. One can imagine certain forms of attacks necessitating preemption. Say there's like a dirty bomb or a nuclear weapon, or some huge attack like 9/11. I can see more why you would want to consider preemption. But in the case of NSPM 7, it lists Kirk's assassination. It lists other forms of political violence that have taken place, much smaller in scale than anything I think that would necessitate a counterterrorism response. But in any case, that's what it orders, and it lists. So since a crime has not been committed in the case of terrorism, you're trying to prevent a terrorist attack. How do you go after it? Well, you need something called indicators. Again, pre-crime. Indications of a likelihood of a future crime. Those indicators it lists very explicitly as, I'll give you just several examples, or maybe a dozen or so. Anti-Christianity, anti-Americanism, I think one was traditional family values. So like sweeping categories that I imagine would cover millions and millions of people. And I was honestly shocked when I saw it, because I knew this wasn't an executive order. I knew this was telling Justice Department and the FBI's field offices, again, in all 50 states, prioritize this. And there's this lazy response by the media in two ways. One, to say, oh, you can't, there's no law for domestic terrorism. So again, it's a little bit subtle. They're correct. That's narrowly true. There's no domestic terrorism statute. That doesn't mean the FBI can't investigate domestic terrorism. It doesn't mean the FBI doesn't have a domestic terrorism list, which they do. That means they can open up cases with this very light predicate that I just described, these so-called indicators. So that is what the terrorism charge allows them to do. Maybe you won't face charges for it in court, but the FBI can look at you and then find other charges that they could actually bring against you. So it's a subtle difference that the media's completely missed. In the case of all of these indicators, I think there's this impression, oh, that's so broad. How are they going to do this? They all are already acting on this memorandum. Within 2 days, Pam Bondi put out a document showing that they're creating an anti-ICE crimes task force, citing throughout it this memorandum. Nonprofit groups, the memorandum directs the Treasury Department to start monitoring cash flow because they are convinced that there's some kind of orchestrated campaign of financing the so-called left-wing radical terrorism. So law firms are already advising their clients in the nonprofit space to adopt different language so that they don't run afoul of the law. I've talked to people at nonprofits that are saying they're behaving differently. So it's already having a chilling effect on speech. The question is, to what extent will they go after these indicators and investigate terrorism through this network of thousands of what are called joint terrorism task forces established after 9/11 and existing in every single state? To what extent are they going to send those after people? And that's what we don't yet know. But everything else that I've described has already happened.
It is no conspiracy or exaggeration to point out that the history of the FBI shows that in the 60s and 70s and after 9/11, there were active efforts not just to investigate, but to plant moles in these organizations, in left-wing or organizations in the 60s and 70s, activist organizations, to try and foment discord or provoke people into committing something that could be a crime. One of the things that was so scandalous after 9/11 was the FBI kind of finding hapless, mentally ill Muslim men and trying to convince them to plan a terror attack so they could show that they'd stop the potential terror attack. That's happened. And if they take this directive seriously, the directive directs them to do more of this, directed not towards, as you say, the list here is really remarkable. And it says, groups like the DSA might think, okay, well, we don't, obviously we're completely nonviolent, so we don't have anything to fear. But it says groups that foment political violence before they result in violent political acts. And then, as you say, the list is anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the U.S. government, extremism on migration. So, anyone who supports more liberal immigration policies, extremism on race, anyone who says racism exists, extremism on gender, anyone who's pro-transgender, hostility towards, as you said, traditional American views on family, religion, or morality. Really, so broad that it captures basically everyone to the left of MAGA. And if depending on how seriously this order is taken, not just, as I say, investigations, but efforts to just, it says disrupt the political activities of basically anyone who isn't MAGA.
Yeah, counterterrorism is a very ugly business. Again, when you are trying to preempt a crime before it has happened, how do you find out about it? You definitionally have to look at speech, because that's the only way that you can get some indication of what's going on. How do you monitor speech? That could be social media monitoring. That could be a whole army of informants, which the FBI already has. You can read about them in the Inspector General reports that the Justice Department puts out on the FBI. It goes right back to, you were mentioning COINTELPRO earlier. Well, that's how you find out about things before they've happened. You have what are called tripwire individuals in different organizations or offices, people that can flag something for you that's of interest. And what I want to stress most of all is, just because you don't engage in violence doesn't mean that any of those other indicators you don't meet. And then at that point, they can open up an investigation. And then at that point, they're looking at your taxes. Did you file your taxes correctly? There's a whole continuum that media just misses. They're saying, well, is Trump going to do the maximalist approach to this? Is the is the Justice Department and law enforcement, are they going to do the maximalist? But that's not the question. The question is, where in this continuum? And we've already seen nonprofit organizations being advised and taking advice to talk differently. We've already seen the chilling speech effect. And there's this whole distance between, rounding everyone up and just causing headaches with taxes, for instance. That could be another step along the continuum. There's all kinds of ways that this could be implemented short of some kind of Alex Jones fever dream. And that's what the media misses when they give this very lazy and reflexive response, like, oh, Trump says a lot of things. How do we take it seriously?
Yeah. Well, and you point out also in your reporting, we talk a lot about at Current Affairs about the fecklessness and weakness of the Democratic opposition. It's not just a media failure of reporting, but you point out that almost no members of Congress have even commented on this new directive.
Yeah, a couple of days after my story, I can't stress enough how interested ordinary people are in this story. Like moms emailing me, be like, I'd like to learn more. How can I get involved in this? So this lie that, oh, it's too subtle. I can't tell you how many times in media people are told this by editors. Are like, oh, it's too in the weeds, this kind of thing. I have not seen that to be the case at all in terms of the numbers of readers and just anecdotally people responding to it. So part of that was a couple days after, a reporter at, I think it was called Courthouse News, was clearly interested in the story and realized what we saw in it, which is, wow, this is really crazy. So he just physically runs up to some of these members on the Hill who have committee assignments related to national security and just asks them, hey, what do you think of this? So he asked in one case, it was Dick Durbin, who is the, I think, number 2 senator, Democratic senator in the Senate, very powerful individual, ranking member overseeing the Judiciary Committee, whose responsibility is overseeing the FBI. It's like their whole thing. And he asked me, he said, oh, what do you think of NSPM 7? He goes, I don't know what it is. It sounds bad. And then he goes up to Alyssa Slotkin, the senator from, I always joke, I call her the senator from Langley, because she's always talking about her CIA service, which I don't think is disqualifying necessarily, but it's like she's constantly like, I'm a national security expert. She has
certainly nothing to be proud of.
She has a video series called The Intel Report. Like, she brands herself around being this expert. And she says, we need to have a counter-terror, all this. I mean, it's her whole thing. And they asked her, same answer. I don't know what it is. Sounds bad. And then this weird wishy-washy response, you should read it. It's really crazy. She says, but violence on both sides is a problem. It's like, what? That is your reaction to this?
Well, I mean, it is remarkable. Just to summarize here, to conclude, why this is so important. And you talk to law firms who said, yes, this has very serious legal implications. There is always this danger, as you've mentioned, of because Trump does 100 things a day, the Steve Bannon phrase, flood the zone. We're going to do so much shit that people can't tell the stupid, the nonsense, the things that don't matter, from crusade against Antifa. Well, Antifa is pretty small, from the things that are really, really serious. And as we've emphasized here, the text of the directive suggests it's targeted at fighting violence, but then defines violence in a way that includes nonviolent actors, because it says they have to stop violence before it happens. And that all of these things, basically holding any political position that isn't complete agreement with the administration, because it's, anything on gender, anything contrary to family value, anything, 10 points. And if you believe in even one of those points, then you are a potentially violent actor. It has essentially defined all political dissent against MAGA ideology as potentially fomenting violence and directing state agencies to investigate and disrupt it. That's what we're ultimately talking about, if we're being clear.
Yeah, that counterterror approach is key to understanding why this is different and how, because that introduces an entirely different approach to going after things. You don't have to have committed a crime for them to look at you. And the Trump administration, both himself personally and Stephen Miller, his Homeland Security advisor in particular, have made abundantly clear that they are just talking about the garden variety left. I mean, Trump keeps talking about the Soros Foundation, how they're going to look at their funding structure. This is well within the mainstream. I mean, that's closer to the center than all sorts of activist groups. So this is not some fringe you're looking at, I don't know, like Chaz or Cop City or something. This is well within the mainstream of the country. And what's more, just to make the point that this is not just rhetoric, Kash Patel a couple of weeks ago, right after Charlie Kirk's assassination, testified to Congress that there has been a 300% increase in domestic terror investigations opened up by the FBI since his appointment. And so it's already happening. They don't immediately announce the investigations that they have opened. The ones that we've seen brought to trial are the result of often years and years of investigations. So the vast majority of that, we don't even know what it is. The only hint we have was what Patel said, which was that the majority of them are what are called, or he said, quote, a large chunk of it is nihilistic violent extremists, which in the past, the FBI has used these categories to hide political actors under, so that when they have to provide data, they can say, oh, it was an explosion in nihilistic violent extremists. And then, because they're not going to want to say, oh, the Democrat category went up. It doesn't work. They're smart enough bureaucratically to understand you shouldn't do that. So the question is, what's going on in this huge explosion? of domestic terrorism cases. And now coming into this new directive that supercharges the national security system. And one last thing I want to say here, these joint terrorism task forces that are responsible for carrying a lot of the stuff out on the ground, he doesn't have to build that logistical infrastructure that I was describing before. The JTTF since 9/11 exists in every state. And what's interesting about them is, unlike the National Guard, they are not restricted by posse comitatus. When you see the National Guard, and you said earlier, people often, might not know what is just Trump talk. I think a lot of the Guard stuff, I've characterized that as theater, something that should certainly be opposed and that is corrosive to the democratic culture, no question. But the reason they're wandering around picking up trash is because they literally don't have the legal authority to go and do something. So they're really restricted in that way. But what's sort of ingenious about what this memorandum does is these joint terrorism task forces, just like the Guard, they exist in every state. They can be tapped and tasked at any moment, but they don't have posse comitatus because they're law enforcement. So this is like a really useful arrow in Trump's quiver that we have yet to see how it's going to be applied.
Well, I'm a little concerned because I realized that I qualify, I think, about 9 out of the 10 categories of
high score
beliefs. I'm pretty sure I qualify. I don't support the overthrow of the United States government, although I'm sure they would classify me as supporting things that are tantamount to that. One thing just to emphasize at the end here is that what constitutes the news is manufactured by editorial choices. And, if the New York Times wanted to, they could blast the headline on, top above the fold, a giant headline, spanning the entire.
And I guarantee you, if they did that, Congress would then act. So much of this is about information bubbles. It's not so much nefariousness. In some sense, that's even worse than that. If it was nefarious, at least they would know what's going on. I think they're genuinely clueless because these guys on Capitol Hill, I lived there for 5 years. They're reading the New York Times and they're watching cable news. That's it. They're not watching anything else.
I mean, if you can imagine if the front page of the New York Times said Trump orders all state resources towards massive crackdown on all beliefs other than his own, people would wake up. But there's an editorial choice made. And I think one of the reasons you've been something of I say this as a compliment, a broken record on this this directive, is because you're pleading with people to treat this with the seriousness that objectively it demands.
Yeah, in which only those papers have the privilege and power and authority to reach those officials in government with. I mean, I don't want to say all officials. Congressman Mark Pocan, Pramila Jayapal are circulating language on this. So certainly some members of Congress have responded to it, but I'm saying by and large, the political establishment has not. And that's what I'm trying to draw attention to, because I can't tell you how many times, like the Iraq War, once you've went in, it's too late then. I would love to have us preempt something, just like the national security state is constantly trying to do with this counterterrorism stuff.
Hope you're enjoying this interview. If you want to listen to full-length current affairs interviews before they are made fully available to the public, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/current affairs and become a supporter today.